For one full day, the most important body in human history lay sealed behind a stone, and the Gospels say almost nothing about it. Friday is told hour by hour. The trial before sunrise, the crown of thorns, the nails, the darkness that fell over the land at noon, the final cry from the cross, and Sunday arrives in a flood of detail. The rolled stone, the folded cloths, the women running, the risen voice in the garden. But between them sits a day of silence. Saturday, the Sabbath. The tomb sealed shut, a Roman guard outside, and inside, stillness. The Gospels do not narrate that day. They do not tell us what happened in the dark hours when the body lay in the grave. And the question that silence leaves behind has followed the church for 2,000 years. Where was he? Not the body we can locate. It rested in a borrowed tomb, cut from rock, wrapped in linen, anointed with myrrh and aloes. That part the Gospels make clear. The harder question is the one the Gospels do not answer directly. Where was Jesus himself during those 3 days? What happened in the space between the last breath on Friday and the first breath of resurrection on Sunday morning? Scripture does not give us a single, simple scene, but it does not leave us with nothing either. Scattered across the New Testament are verses that seem to point somewhere. Fragments, hints, a handful of strange and powerful lines that early Christians read as windows into that hidden day. When you gather them, a picture begins to form, and it is far stranger than rest. The first clue comes from the cross itself, before Jesus even died. He was not alone there. 2 others were crucified beside him, condemned criminals nailed up on his left and his right. One of them mocked him. But the other, in his last hours of agony, turned toward Jesus and asked to be remembered when Jesus came into his kingdom. And Jesus answered him. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, he says, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Today, not someday, not at the end of the age. Today. That single word is a clue we cannot ignore. If Jesus and the dying thief would be together in paradise that very day, then death, at least, was not a doorway into nothing. Something continued. Someone went somewhere. It does not answer every question, but it makes one thing hard to hold: the idea that death is simply an unconscious sleep, a switch turned off until the end of the age. But where is paradise? In the world of the New Testament, the word carried the sense of a garden, a place of rest and blessing, a sheltered place for the righteous beyond death. It was not yet the full vision of heaven that later Scripture would unfold. It was a place where the faithful waited. Christians have long debated exactly what Jesus meant, how to read that today, and whether paradise names the same place as heaven or a waiting place distinct from it. The promise itself is certain. Its precise geography is not. What the words make hard to avoid is this. On Saturday, while his body lay in the tomb, Jesus was not simply nowhere. He had told a dying man they would meet that very day, in a reality the Gospels do not describe. That is the first thread. The next comes from Jesus himself, spoken long before the cross. Earlier in his ministry, religious leaders demanded a sign. They wanted proof. And Jesus gave them an answer that must have sounded like a riddle. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12, he points back to the prophet Jonah. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, he says, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The heart of the earth. He did not say the tomb. He did not say the grave. He chose a phrase that pointed deeper, downward, into the hidden interior of things. For the ancient ear, this was not only about a body lying underground. It echoed the language of the realm of the dead. the place beneath, where all souls were believed to descend. Jesus was describing his death as a journey, a descent, a passage into the deepest place, and a return. And the comparison to Jonah is not accidental. Jonah went down into the deep, swallowed by the sea, brought as low as a living man can go. And then he came back up, delivered, sent out alive. Jesus took that story and made it a sign of himself. Notice what kind of sign it is. Jonah's descent was not a place of comfort. From inside the great fish, he prayed as one already in the grave, sinking down to the roots of the mountains, with the deep closing over him and the bars of the earth shutting behind him. That is the language Jonah used. And that is the sign Jesus chose for his own death. He was not describing a quiet sleep. He was describing a journey to the lowest place and a return from it. The sign of Jonah was never only about a fish. It was about going down into the dark and coming back through it. So we have two threads now, a promise of paradise on the same day, and a prophecy of 3 days in the heart of the earth. Both point to the same gap. Both suggest that the silence of Saturday was not empty. And then comes the strangest passage of all. It appears in the first letter of Peter, chapter 3. Peter writes that Christ suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring us to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. And then Peter adds a line that has puzzled readers ever since. In the spirit, he says, Christ went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison, to those who disobeyed long ago in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built. Read that again slowly. This is one of the most debated passages in the entire New Testament, and Christians have never fully agreed on what it means. On one reading, it describes something that happened in the gap itself. Christ, alive in the Spirit, going to spirits held in a kind of prison and proclaiming his victory there. On another reading, the proclaiming happened long before, when the Spirit of Christ preached through Noah to a rebellious generation while the ark was still being built. The words can be heard both ways, and Scripture does not force the choice. But on either reading, the same haunting detail remains. These spirits are connected somehow to the days of Noah, to the time just before the flood. Who were they? This is where the passage becomes genuinely difficult, and where honest interpreters have disagreed for centuries. One ancient reading connects these imprisoned spirits to a story buried in the early chapters of Genesis and expanded in Jewish writings from the centuries before Christ. Genesis chapter 6 speaks of mysterious figures, the sons of God, who crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross, and of the violence and corruption that filled the earth before the flood. In Jewish literature outside the Bible, texts like 1 Enoch, which was widely read in the time of Jesus but was not received into most biblical canons, these rebellious beings are called the Watchers. According to those writings, they were bound and imprisoned in the deep to await judgment. It must be said plainly. First, Enoch is not scripture for most of the church. It is an ancient Jewish text, valuable for understanding how people in that era thought. But it does not carry the authority of the Bible. We should not read it as if it does. Yet here is what makes the passage in Peter so striking. Peter, writing under inspiration, reaches back to the days of Noah and to spirits in prison. The same world of imagery those older writings used. Some scholars believe Peter is drawing on that shared background to make a point about Christ's victory. Others believe the spirits in prison are simply the human dead of Noah's generation, and that Christ proclaimed something to them. The difference matters. If the spirits are those rebellious beings bound in the deep, then Peter is saying that Christ's descent reached even into the lowest prison of the powers that had defied God. since before the flood, and announced his triumph over them on their own ground. If the spirits are the human dead, then Peter is telling us that even the generation destroyed in the flood was not beyond the reach of what Christ did. Either way, the same astonishing truth stands. There is no cell so deep, no prisoner so far down, that the proclamation of the crucified Christ could not arrive there. Scripture does not settle the matter for us, but on the reading that places this proclamation between the cross and the resurrection, the claim is striking: that the crucified Christ was not unconscious and was not idle, that he went and made a proclamation in a place where the imprisoned and the dead could hear it. Whether or not that is the right reading, the passage refuses to let death have the final silence. Peter returns to this idea a chapter later. In chapter 4, he writes that the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that, though judged in the flesh as all people are, they might live in the spirit as God lives. Whatever the full meaning, the direction is unmistakable. The reach of what Christ did on the cross did not stop at the edge of the living world. It went down into the realm of the dead, into the place of those who had already passed. That brings us to the word that names this idea: the descent. In the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, Paul quotes an old line from the Psalms about one who ascended on high and led a host of captives in his train. And then Paul pauses on a single word in that verse: he ascended. But what does ascended mean, Paul asks, except that he also first descended into the lower regions, into the earth? He who descended is the very one who ascended far above all the heavens. Down first, then up. A descent before the rising. But descended to where? Here too, Christians have read the line in more than one way. Many have understood the lower regions of the earth as the realm of the dead beneath, the underworld Christ entered after the cross. Others have read it differently, that the descent Paul means is the incarnation itself, the Son coming down from heaven into the world, or simply his coming down to the earth of the living. The words allow more than one hearing, and in the older translations, the captives are described in a haunting phrase. He led captivity captive. He took prisoner the very thing that had taken us prisoner. He went down and came back up, leading those who had been held, whichever way the verse is read. It became the seed of something larger, joined to the other scattered texts. The promise of paradise, the 3 days in the heart of the earth, the spirits in prison. It gave the church a way to speak of Christ entering the lowest place of the human story. The Latin tradition called it the descensus ad inferos, the descent to the lower places, the going down of Christ into the realm of the dead. And the reason that reading became so important was simple. If Christ had gone down even into death's own country and returned, then there was no part of the human condition, not even the grave, that he had not entered and overcome. But to understand why that mattered so much, we have to understand what death looked like to the people of the Bible. They did not picture the dead simply vanishing. In the Hebrew scriptures, the place of the dead was called Sheol, a shadowed underworld where the departed waited. It was spoken of as a land below, a place of dust and silence, where kings and beggars alike lay down together and the noise of the living world faded away. To go down to Sheol was to pass beyond reach, beyond the warmth of the sun, into the country from which no traveler returned. By the time of Jesus, Jewish thought had developed this further. There was a place of comfort for the righteous and a place of torment for the wicked. And the dead waited there for the final resurrection that the prophets had promised. The grave was not the end of the story. It was a waiting room. But a waiting room with no door and no key, held shut by a power no human had ever overcome. Jesus himself painted this picture. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, he tells of a rich man and a poor beggar named Lazarus. Both die. The beggar is carried to a place of comfort that Jesus calls Abraham's side. The rich man finds himself in torment. Between them is a great chasm that none can cross. It is a story about mercy and judgment. But it also reveals the landscape of the dead, as Jesus described it. A divided realm, the righteous resting in comfort, all of them still waiting for something not yet finished. That waiting matters, at least in the way much of Christian tradition came to read it. In that reading, especially the one tied to the harrowing of hell, even the faithful dead, Abraham, Moses, David, the prophets, had not yet entered the fullness of what God had promised. They were held in hope, waiting in the place of the dead for a deliverance that had not yet come. Scripture does not spell this out as a doctrine in so many words. But it was the picture many early Christians believed they saw forming behind the texts. And so early Christians came to read these passages as pointing towards something bold. That when Christ died, he entered that realm not as a prisoner, but as a conqueror. Listen to how Peter preaches it on the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts, chapter 2. He proclaims that God raised Jesus, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. And then Peter quotes King David from Psalm 16. You will not abandon my soul to the realm of the dead, nor let your Holy One see decay. You will not abandon me to the realm of the dead. Peter argues that David was not speaking of himself, for David died, and his tomb was still there for all to see. David was speaking, as a prophet, of the Messiah, of the one who would go down into death and not be held by it, of the one whose soul would not be abandoned in that shadowed place. And so many in the church came to understand that silent Saturday this way, that Christ descended as the one death could not contain, entering its territory not to be held by it, but carrying the keys. And there is one more scene, perhaps the most overlooked moment in the entire account of the crucifixion. It happens at the instant Jesus dies, and most readers pass over it without slowing down. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, the moment Jesus breathes his last, the curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shakes, rocks split, and then Matthew records something almost beyond belief. The tombs were opened, he writes, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And after Jesus' own resurrection, they came out of the tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. The dead came out of their graves. Matthew gives us only these few sentences. He does not explain. He does not linger. He simply tells us that at the death of Christ, the graves of the holy ones broke open, and the dead were raised and seen. It is the most ignored event in the whole story of the Passion. We rush past it because we do not know what to do with it. But there it stands, recorded in the Gospel, sitting exactly at the seam, at the death, pointing toward the resurrection, in the very window of that silent Saturday. Notice the order Matthew gives. The tomb split open at the moment Jesus died on Friday. But the saints did not walk out until after his resurrection. It is as if the death cracked the doors of the grave and the rising flung them wide. The two events bracket the silent day between them, and the open tombs hang there in the middle like a question. Matthew does not tell us what it proves, and we should not force it to say more than it does. But it may function as a sign that in the death of Christ, The power of the grave had already begun to break. Not the whole story underneath, but the first crack in death's hold. The locked doors beginning to give way. From this point onward, we are no longer dealing with one simple biblical scene, but with the way Christians have gathered scattered texts into a doctrine. So how did the church make sense of all this? By the early centuries of the faith, Christians had gathered these threads into a single confession. In the words handed down in the Apostles' Creed, the church declared that Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. And then, in many forms of the creed, the line follows. He descended to the dead. He descended. The church confessed it as part of the story of salvation. The Son of God did not skip from the cross to the empty tomb. He went down first. But what did he do down there? Here, the tradition offers more than one answer, and faithful Christians have held different views. The oldest and most widespread reading in the early church was one of rescue. They taught that Christ descended to the place where the righteous dead were waiting, the patriarchs, the prophets, all who had died in faith before him, and that he opened the way for them. He proclaimed his victory, broke the power of death, and led the waiting righteous out of the shadows and into the presence of God. In the imagery the early church loved, this was the harrowing of the dead, the day the gates of death were shattered from the inside. Picture it the way those early Christians did. Generations of the faithful had died in hope, never having seen the promise fulfilled. Abraham, who was told his offspring would bless the nations. Moses, who glimpsed a land he never entered. David, who sang of one his own descendant would become. Isaiah, who wrote of a suffering servant he would never meet. They had all gone down into the place of the dead, carrying a promise they could not yet collect. And then, on a single silent Sabbath, the one they had been promised came down to find them. A second reading focuses not on rescue, but on proclamation. In this view, the descent was Christ's announcement of his triumph. A declaration, even to the imprisoned spirits Peter mentions, that his victory was complete and their judgment was sealed. Not a second chance, but a verdict proclaimed. A third reading is quieter. Some have understood the 3 days simply as the true rest of death, that Christ genuinely died as we die, his body in the tomb and his spirit in the hands of the Father, sharing fully in our mortality so that he might redeem it from the inside. And there are those who weave these together, rest and proclamation and rescue all folded into one mystery too large for a single sentence. Scripture does not hand us a verdict. It hands us the verses. Luke's promise of paradise. Matthew's 3 days in the heart of the earth. Peter's spirits in prison and gospel preached to the dead. Paul's descent into the lower regions and his captives led free. The torn veil and the open tombs. The ancient confession that he descended. Each interpretation is anchored to a text. None of them can claim to have closed the question. And that, perhaps, is exactly the point. Because here is what is most remarkable about that lost day. The Bible could have filled it with a clear and detailed scene. It could have given us a chapter describing every step of where Christ went and what he did. It did not. Instead, it gives us silence, and clues scattered through the silence like light through a cracked door. Maybe that is deliberate. Maybe what happened between the cross and the empty tomb was simply too vast to be held in a single verse. A descent into the deepest place of human fear. A confrontation with death on its own ground. A proclamation heard in the prison of the dead. A rescue of those who had waited in hope across the centuries. The Gospels narrate Friday because we needed to see the price. They narrate Sunday because we needed to see the victory. But Saturday they leave veiled. The hidden day. the day the king walked through the country of the dead. We were not given a window into that day. We were given the result. On the third morning, the stone was rolled away, and the one who had gone down into death came up out of it, alive, holding in his hand the keys of death and the grave. Whatever happened in that silence, this much the empty tomb declares. Death is no longer the deepest place. Christ has been deeper, and he came back. So when you stand at your own losses, at the graves of those you love, at the silence that grief leaves behind, remember the day the Gospels would not narrate. Remember that the silence of Saturday was not absence. It was a descent. And remember that the one who went down into the heart of the earth did not stay there. He rose, and he left the door open behind him,